The following program is a presentation of the Nassau Institute.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's an enormous delight for me personally to introduce our speaker this evening, because both as a personal friend, but also because of such a high-quality speaker, as we all know. It would be, I think, invidious, or should I say superfluous, to describe Julian Francis, because although I've been given this CV this evening, and I am not going to go through all this because everybody knows who Julian Francis is, perhaps the best known person in the financial world and business world in the Bahamas. But could I just remind you very, very briefly to remind you that he was the governor of the central bank and chairman of the board of directors of the bank from 1997 to 2005. He was co-chairman and CEO of the Grand Bahama Port Authority, and also the executive chairman of Batelco, or should we say BTC these days, during that difficult and interesting period of leading up to privatization. I'm sure other people will have heard him, the Business Outlook. Richard Coulson, I can see over there. Enjoyed your piece this morning, Richard, in the paper. And so many people have heard him. So we are in for a real treat this evening. And so may I now ask Julian Francis to address us.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I'd like to begin by thanking you all for being here this evening. I really consider it a tremendous honor to have been invited to attend here. And so I look forward particularly to maybe a discussion after the formal comments. And I really feel that I have to say that this subject, which I have agreed to talk about this evening, is a very complex one. And in order to have a presentation which sort of fits the time frame, and which in fact also, I have to admit, saves me having to do weeks of work, I've had to keep it relatively straightforward and not try to look into all of the complexities of the subject. But I hope that you'll find it interesting. So let me begin. In his farewell address in January of 1961, the US President Dwight Eisenhower said, "We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage," unquote. How did I get into this? At a luncheon with Rick Lowe a few months ago, during which, and you would probably not be aware of this, but during which Rick and I sorted out many of the difficult problems facing the world, we inevitably turned to some of the pressing issues facing our country. And by the way, Rick, you see that they've now got a more moderate president in Iran. We saw that one. We got a new pope. Venezuela is calm after Chavez. The only one we haven't solved is Syria. It was on that occasion that I foolishly agreed to be a guest speaker at this forum. I say foolishly because I realized even then that this would be a demanding audience, and that I would in fact have to do a fair amount of work in order to prepare these comments. And I trust that nevertheless you'll forgive the errors which come out of my laziness and perhaps some misguided thoughts. Misguided thoughts of a semi-retired student of economics. And once again, I feel almost obliged to make a little joke about economics, because I always, well, not always, but I sometimes say to people that I'm not an economist, which I'm not. But like one of the characters in the Popeye, I think, cartoons, who said, when asked if he attended college, he said, "No, I never did, but I watched other people attend." And I feel a little bit like that with economics. Some of you will remember the late Archdeacon William Thompson, who was an enlightened and wise man, I think. Archdeacon Thompson used to say often that we in this community focused too much on the short term, and that in our preoccupation with certain of the challenges of our time, we lacked perspective. That if we could have a sense of the history of social evolution, we would understand that difficult moments in the short term are inevitable, but that in time they right themselves. Now, when I refer to difficult moments, I don't want you to misunderstand me as saying that the question of public borrowing and debt, that on these questions we are necessarily at a point which equals others of the pressing urgencies of our country, such as crime and education and so on. You know the list. I don't in fact think that we are there. What I do think is that during the past 15 years or so, on the question of public debt, we have lost a discipline which characterized the management of our public finances in periods up to that point. And what concerns me most about this is that while we know well that a significant part of the public deficits we have incurred over the last decade or so have resulted from rapid and unforeseen changes externally, yet there appears to be on the part of our policymakers considerably reduced sensitivity to the risks and the implications for our country of the increasing levels of public borrowing which we are experiencing today. And I would like to say that I believe that the current government has taken a major step in principle toward modernizing the financing of the operation of public governance in the Bahamas through the decision to introduce value-added taxation. And let me say, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a major positive development which is years, probably decades overdue. Yet despite this, we have no basis to conclude for the moment that there is a reasonably clear path to where the government of the Bahamas is taking us on this vital issue of planning for public spending and the public debt. And let me say as well that while I believe that this is a very important step in principle, as I said, I'm not necessarily saying that I personally believe that value-added tax is the solution. But I do believe that the willingness of the government to make a decision on this issue of rationalizing our taxation is certainly something to be happy about. Before proceeding to define more specifically where I think we are and where I think we would like to see ourselves on the issue of the debt, I'd like to say two things to sort of set the stage. Firstly, I mentioned the late Archdeacon Thompson a moment ago because I feel that as a general principle, it is entirely true that our views on different aspects of our development do lack perspective. But you know, we in the Bahamas are guilty also of a too relaxed attitude on so many of those undergirding issues which define the quality of our society. Issues such as the integrity of our institutions, their structure, leadership, their independence, accountability, etc. Issues such as public education and whether or not it is adequate to serve the needs of a small developing country in a fast evolving world. Public policy in general on vital issues such as immigration, crime containment, the character of economic development. These are all highly critical issues with respect to which we as a community have yet to mobilize, to develop broad consensus, and to determine how we go about ensuring that the Bahamas which is out there being built is the Bahamas which we want, and that which we would feel proud and confident leaving to our children. And I can't emphasize this point enough. The fact is that we are simply not involved on the civic level in the Bahamas. On far too many of these critical issues, we either consciously transfer these citizens' responsibilities to our elected political representatives, or we assume that this aspect of nation building also is, quote, what we elect them for, unquote. The issue of the public debt is, I think, one such issue. And I hope that I will develop that a bit more fully as I proceed. I said I wanted to say two things. The second thing which I want to say is I'd like to be very clear. I haven't recognized any members of the press here this evening, but I would like to make it very clear that I am not seeking this evening to be critical of either a political party or the current government in these remarks. I am in fact convinced that both of the major political parties which have governed our country since independence had equally been committed during an earlier period to a higher level of fiscal prudence, and more recently have both lost their way. Obviously, what is important today, however, is how we go forward. I'd just like to spend a moment reminding you what the public debt is. I mean, it sounds obvious, but I think it's useful for the framing of the discussion to do that. The public debt is the accumulation of borrowings and commitments to pay by the national government and its various agencies. These agencies, which are generally the wholly owned public corporations. Public debt almost always results from unfunded spending commitments by the national government relative to its operating and capital expenditure. The operating budget, of course, covers yearly or recurrent expenditure, and the capital budget relates to investment disbursements which the government undertakes to build social and economic infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, airports, roads, etc. Yeah, so public debt is really the result of unfunded commitments for expenditure and investments by the government, either on its operating or its capital accounts. As with the private households, the accepted principle has been that a government aims to cover its annual recurrent expenditure from the collection of revenues during that year, and if possible, allocate a portion of that revenue to capital spending, to a capital spending plan. A bit like households maybe invest in the essential living requirements, and if possible, there's something left over for income generating investments. You should be aware, I would say, that most of the measures which are commonly in use today relating to public economic statistics were developed and put into use during the decade or so following the end of World War II as part of the so-called Bretton Woods arrangements. One of the most commonly used measure of public debt internationally is the relatively well-known debt to GDP ratio, GDP or gross domestic product. Essentially, this ratio, yes, I was saying that essentially this debt to GDP ratio seeks to quantify how much debt the government itself owes in relation to the size of the economy. And again, the principle of the debt service ratio, with which many here are familiar, relating to private households and their borrowings from commercial banks, is the same. Lenders look at the ability of the country to pay its debts to a large extent as a function of how much debt it owes in relation to the size of the economy. Now, I said at the beginning that I've maybe simplified some of these concepts, and this is one of them, because actually it's not only the size of the economy you would look at, you would also look at, in fact, external revenues and those kinds of things. But essentially, for this purpose, the debt service, debt to GDP ratio is a pretty good surrogate for the points which I would like to illustrate. As you can imagine, it's not really easy to establish rules of thumb to determine ability to pay relating to the approximately 195 countries which are recognized around the world. There are vast differences and circumstances which relate to all of these countries. Differences of size, stage of development, endowment with natural resources, habitable land, status of technological development and use, education, etc. These differences, in broad terms, determine the relative ability of countries to generate or avail themselves of money, either to repay the borrowings which they have made or will engage, or not to have to borrow at all, because they generate all of the money their governments and people need for daily living and for the development of the country's infrastructure. A good example of resource endowment, for example, for our purposes would be petroleum-rich countries. Not too many oil-rich countries have to worry about borrowing to cover their budgetary needs. Another interesting example today would be ample cheap labor combined with a dynamic industrial sector, such as China, which China, that is, within 3 decades has become potentially the world's largest lender of capital. And in fact, China probably today holds about 15% of the $16 trillion debt of the United States, to give you an idea of how quickly the Chinese have been able to make the transition to wealth as a result of the elements of economic production and economic wealth generation which they have. Now, I started here talking about it not being easy to establish rules of thumb to determine or to compare countries on the question of ability to pay. And I said that it's difficult to do that because of the differences in these countries. But, in fact, bankers and economists had, by the 70s, the decade of the 70s, done just that. They developed these Bretton Woods arrangements, or arrangements which came out of Bretton Woods, really, which were intended to make it easier to compare countries. I think a very straightforward way of expressing it would be this. If a country was not a major industrial power which is selling badly needed or highly sought after products around the world, or if the country was not an exporter of some vital resource, then the rule went. That country would likely be subject to a rule which says that your debt to GDP ratio should not, on average, exceed 40%. Now we are talking about the 70s, 80s, that period. And obviously, I started talking about some exceptions to that, those industrially powerful countries which sell badly needed goods to the rest of the world, and those countries also which sell badly needed commodities to the world. As I'm sure we can all think about things like nuclear plants and electric plants and aircraft and other heavy machinery. In the mid-60s, 70s, 80s, countries which were in the business of selling those kinds of products to the rest of the world were really the countries which got a leg up on everybody else. And these are the countries that really became the countries that we have considered the developed industrial countries even still today. And I don't have to tell you that those countries which had the means of producing and exporting valuable and highly sought after commodities such as petroleum also very quickly amassed huge amounts of wealth. And these, of course, are the OPEC countries. You may have noted that this system, which provided the facility of countries to borrow in a large way, was the... I'm sorry, I just lost my place for a second. Yes. The point I'm making here is that the large industrial countries which began to export in a big way in the 70s were the countries which sponsored some of the institutions which were established at Bretton Woods and supported those institutions. And these were also the countries which sponsored some of the major banks which subsequently provided credit to the developing countries around the world. And again, these developments took place in the wake of World War II. If you look at the decades following World War II, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and even the 80s to some extent, you see that this was the way the world worked. And what you see is that countries which were not the exporting countries, but which were countries which had to buy the exports from the exporting countries, these were the countries which were borrowing. They were the countries which amassed very large volumes of debt during those 3 or 4 decades. And this system culminated in the 1980s, in the early 80s, with the so-called LDC debt crisis. This was the time at which, in 1982, for example, a major country in Latin America like Mexico, but followed subsequently by a number of other countries, defaulted on their external debt because they simply had gotten to the point where they had borrowed far too much money. The point I am really getting at is that this rule of thumb of 40% of GDP, which had been put into place by the banking system and regulators back then, had been systematically violated because there was so much money being thrown about. The OPEC countries had amassed huge amounts of money, which they had to recycle. The major industrial countries were in a similar position. And there was just a borrowing binge going on, which resulted eventually, and I'll give you some statistics a little bit later, in, again, these rules of thumb being violated, and eventually in the early 80s, we went into a period of default and restructuring of these countries and so on. And then the system got restarted, and we subsequently found ourselves where we have been in the last decade or so. But I'll get to that. Now, I'd like to define the evolution of the public debt in the Bahamas to give you a sense of what the figures look like and where we've come from and where we are today. And then I'll, at the same time, point to some comparator countries around the world just to give you a sense of how we compare. Figures published by the Central Bank of the Bahamas put the Bahamas national debt at the end of 2011 at $4.36 billion, of which amount about $1 billion was foreign currency debt. Taking into account the approximately $1 billion likely to be added to the debt between 2012 and 2013, it seems quite likely that by the end of the current fiscal year, that is, by the end of June of 2014, the total debt will have approached $5.5 billion, and the external debt, which is a portion of that, a part of that, will be approximately 25% of it. So about $1 billion and a quarter. $5.5 billion of total debt and about $1 billion and a quarter of foreign debt as a part of that total. The International Monetary Fund, in its recent so-called Article 4 report on the Bahamas, estimates that the gross domestic product of the Bahamas at the end of 2013, the end of this year, would be about $8.3 billion. This being the case, the Bahamas debt to GDP ratio at the end of this current fiscal period would be about 60%. And if you go to the end of 2014, the Bahamas debt to GDP ratio would have increased based on the commitments which we know the government has got to fund today. That ratio would have increased to about 65%. Now, those are very important numbers, which I'd like you to just bear in mind for a moment, please. And let me go back just for a minute and give you a little sense of how we've evolved. At the beginning of the 80s, in 1980, or if you like, at the end of 1979, the Bahamas' total national debt was $270 million. And remember, I'm telling you that today it's close to $5 billion. In 1979, at the end of 1979 or at the beginning of 1980, it was 270 million. By the beginning of the 90s, the debt had grown to 915 million. And in January of 2000, it had reached the number of 1.87 or 1.9 billion, so almost $2 billion by January of 2000. So we started, well, we didn't start, but at the beginning of the 80s, we were at 270 million. And if you fast forward to January or so of 2000, we were already at about 1.9 billion. So if you compare the position in January of 2000, when we were at 1.9 billion, if you compare that to where we are today, we have, in that period of time, added something like $3.5 billion to our national debt. Now, how does the Bahamas compare with some of the comparator countries which we sometimes look at? Yeah, and I start with the Caribbean and just taking 2 or 3 of the countries that we know. Barbados has a public debt to GDP ratio at the end of 2012 of 119%. So twice the level that the Bahamas will be at the end of this current year. Jamaica, 139%. And interestingly, Trinidad and Tobago, 47%. Now, I think you remember that both Barbados and Jamaica in this region, but particularly Jamaica, they both have been in IMF restructuring and other private bank restructuring programs for many years now. In the case of Barbados, that's not often that well known, but the fact is that Barbados has been in IMF programs over the last 10, 15 years. And Jamaica, I think it's kind of fair to say that Jamaica lives in those programs. If we look at selected major industrial countries at the end of 2012, what do we see? The United States, 102% of GDP in debt. So practically, if you like, its whole GDP is matched by its public debt. Japan, this was an interesting one for me, 230%. And Germany, 80%. Now China, very interesting case, 16% at the end of 2012, and likely to reduce to 9.7% by the end of 2016. Just to finish the picture, let me comment that during the past 2 years or so, following the 2008 economic recession, which is continuing even today, really, there has been much attention on how European countries have been impacted by the global recession. Note that between 2006 and 2012, the average debt to GDP of the 4 major southern European countries, which are France, Greece, Italy, and Spain, the average GDP increased between 2006 and 2012, those 6 years, from 79.7% or 80% to 107 or 108%. So a pretty significant 28% increase in the debt to GDP ratio of those southern European countries during that period, 2006 to 2012, as a result largely of the difficulties which have been visited on them as a result of the recession and some of the problems which the recession has caused, such as the American securities meltdown and so on. I just mentioned Greece because, I think we often think about Greece, or we see Greece in the press so often, and we talk about it. But the position in Greece is, as you will see, dire. During that period, 2006 to 2012, the Greek debt to GDP ratio increased from 106% to 158%. Clearly, Greece is one of those countries, and we know this as a matter of fact, which is also in serious and severe difficulty with such high levels of debt. And just to finish off the picture, during that particular time frame, 2006 to 2012, and remember it's going to shift again in 2013 and 2014, but the Bahamas came from 32% in 2006 to 50% in 2012. So we can see a pretty fast increase in the public debt in the Bahamas, which of course we very much know. Now I think we may view the fact and evolution of the public debt from three perspectives. One, the economic consequence and implications for the country. Two, transparency and accountability issues. And finally, from the point of view of the country's international standing and prestige. First of all, on the question of economic consequences and implications, because that is really where the rubber hits the road in a big way. And I think you remember I said at the beginning, I don't believe that it's accurate to think that the public debt is the biggest problem in the Bahamas. It's not. And despite these numbers, because of some characteristics which I'll touch on in a minute, you'll see that it is probably not as dire as sometimes we think. While in absolute terms it would be, I think then, an exaggeration to suggest that the Bahamas is on the brink of disaster from the point of view of its potential exposure to continued negative external developments as a result of current and projected debt levels and the composition of the debt, there's no question in my mind that should we continue in the Bahamas to increase the public debt at rates that we have seen over this last decade, within a few short years, we will certainly arrive at levels which, for a small, largely undiversified revenue base, open economic environment, these levels would be unsustainable. Why has the Bahamas been different? In other words, why is it that even at the level of 60%, which is more or less where we're going to be within the next 12 months, even 6 months, why is it that that's still, in my mind, not a huge problem for the Bahamas? Well, it is because of the fact that I pointed out a little while ago. While the total debt in the Bahamas is what it is, 5.5 going to 6.5 billion. The fact is that the foreign currency portion of that which is what, at the end of the day, the country really needs to worry about in terms of its, its ability to service the debt in ways that it cannot control, or from sources which it cannot control. And that's very important because, you see, let me immediately say that as far as domestic debt the Bahamian dollar debt is concerned, the government of the Bahamas does have certain means at its disposal to be able to put itself in a position to, at the very least, roll over that debt and to keep it going without defaults if it needed to do it. But in terms of external debt, you can't do it. That's owed to foreign institutions and foreign parties, and when they say pay us, you've got to either be able to pay or you go bankrupt. And so it is because the Bahamas' foreign currency component of the debt has always been relatively small and still is today. I mean, if you look at countries around the world, and I haven't pulled out those numbers for you this evening, but if you look at a set of countries, you will see that while what we call external debt service ratio of the Bahamas has been 5% of its earnings, the foreign currency earnings of the Bahamas, only 5% of that needs to be devoted to paying the external, or to servicing the external debt. When Mexico went into default in 1982, something like 30% of its income had to go to the payment of the foreign debt. And that was why it was really unsustainable, because they simply could not raise enough money quickly enough to pay that 30% and keep going. The Bahamas doesn't have that problem today. And that is one reason I say that at the moment, the Bahamas can manage this picture. But should we continue the accretion of our total debt at rates which we have seen over the last decade, we will very quickly move from the 60 to 65% ratio up to 70% and further, of course. Now, I have read quite a bit of the literature, and it seems quite evident that once you get above 70% of, that is, debt to GDP, you may not only have issues such as the servicing of the debt, but you have distortions which take place within your economy. The government begins to, what we call, crowd out the private sector, which means that the government has to borrow, of course, so it borrows, but then there's no money left for private business, which of course also needs to be financed. But not only that, and this is probably already a problem in the Bahamas which we are not understanding. When the government begins to borrow so much of the domestic resource, inevitably it pushes the interest rates up. And to that extent, there is a distortion of the credit environment, because normally, given the kind of resources which are recycled around the economy, private business should be able to access credit at certain rates, but if the government is there buying up all of that credit, all of those resources, then at some point it distorts the economy. And as I said, you may not even be aware of that distortion. Let me just make a little point connected to that, which is very interesting. A year and a half or so ago, I was a member of the Insurance Commission. And at some point, the Central Bank of the Bahamas determined that it was necessary or was appropriate to reduce the base interest rates, which really determine the total interest rates on the securities which are issued by the government. So, for example, government would normally be paying 6%, all of a sudden they were paying 5.5%. Guess who was hurt by that? The insurance companies. The insurance companies needed to hold government paper because they need to hold something. And government paper is usually one of the very reliable assets in the economy, in the system. So if they have built all of their financial models, projections, and so on the basis of certain assumptions regarding interest rates, and all of a sudden those interest rates begin to drop, that could very well represent a big problem for them. So it's issues such as those. When you have a one-horse town, obviously, you are exposed to certain problems should things have to change. The second way I believe we can look at this question of public debt is with respect to transparency and accountability issues for the government. To the extent that the public debt represents the accumulation of budget deficits, the government, that is to say, the government is either deciding by borrowing, the government is deciding either I don't want to tax or I will tax later, something like that. In other words, borrowing is nothing more, and this is quite an established point of fact among economists. Borrowing by the government is nothing more than delayed taxation, for the most part. It's not entirely so, because in fact there is a certain level of borrowing which a government, let's say, is entitled to do. And I give you one example. If the government decides we will build a new airport, which will cost $500 million, and that airport is going to inject new life into the economy and bring new tourists and bring new airlines and so on. And in fact, the country is going to benefit from that. It's going to get a return from that money. And so the borrowing is a little bit like when we borrow to start a business or maybe even to build a house. We get use out of that asset which we have financed with the borrowing. But when the government borrows to pay for its recurrent deficit, in other words, to pay public salaries and to pay the expenses of government offices and all of those kinds of things that we all know, that is nothing more than deferred taxation. Now, what I'm suggesting, and I mean, I don't think this is a new idea, is this. The government in any country should not be permitted to do that. Because in so doing, what they are really doing is postponing the obligation to pay that debt to somebody in the future. Our children are going to have to pay that. What they should be required to do is to come to us and to say, we would like to spend more money for these purposes. Do you agree to pay more taxes? If we say no, then perhaps those disbursements shouldn't take place. So there is an accountability issue and a transparency issue here, which countries, I have to say, countries like the Bahamas have not yet grappled with very well. In some countries around the world, I mean, look at the United States. Remember, over the last couple of years, every 6 months, President Obama had to go to the Congress and fight and plead for an increase in the debt. Now, obviously, it's a more complicated picture than that, but what I am saying is that certainly we are at the point, in my view, where we need to begin to look closely at whether it is appropriate to allow the government, whenever it wants, by simply passing a resolution in Parliament, to increase the debt in ways which, as I said already, one, could be injurious to the economy anyway in the short term, and certainly in any event imposes fiscal obligations on future Bahamians about which, of course, they have no say. And so this transparency and accountability issue, I believe, is certainly a very important one. Finally, I think that we would also want to look at the issue of the public debt from the point of view of international standing and prestige of the country. You know, until December of 2012, the Bahamas shared an A credit rating with only a few countries in this hemisphere. Only a few countries. And you can name them consequently on one hand. In December of last year, December 15th, Moody's Investor Services, one of the major rating agencies, as you know, downgraded the Bahamas credit, what is technically one notch, but it did mean that instead of being an A-rated country, we became a B-rated country. Now, there are some nuances within that, scale of ratings. It's not as bad as that, maybe in the short term, really. But nevertheless, being an A country is being an A country. Bankers understand the value of a first-class credit rating, and countries which are members of that club of first-class rated countries also understand it. And ladies and gentlemen, that is where the Bahamas sees itself. That is what we think we are. We believe we are a special little country which can do interesting and important things, and we can compete and so on, we think. We want to be with countries such as Canada, Germany, Singapore, and Switzerland. Our public debt and how it is perceived by discriminating investors and other decision makers is a central element in determining where we are situated in this competition among countries. So it's the way that insurance companies in the United States perceive us, which will determine at the end of the day whether we are really among the A crowd or whether we are B, or maybe even at some point, hopefully not, less. I would like to conclude my remarks at this point by saying that management of the public budgetary process and its implications for public debt is a very complex and difficult issue. I don't want to suggest that one can stand here and, criticize and simplify this and leave the impression that this is really a piece of cake. It's not. It is very, very difficult issues. I am certainly of the view that the Bahamas is still, despite the trend and despite where we are, I think we're still able to avoid the severe dangers which would come with with debt to GDP ratios in excess of 70%. We don't want to go there, and I believe we can avoid that. But it would require firm resolve by the government of the Bahamas over the next 2 to 3 years. Now again, I really believe that the government's willingness to take the bull by the horn and to begin to look seriously at how we should tax ourselves properly, and I don't want to sound like an advocate of taxation. All I'm really saying is that we have to pay for what it is we get. And this is the problem that we have in the Bahamas. We've always actually wanted to have it but not pay for it. I'm talking about the level of government. We want government services. We want to have the good roads, the schools, the hospitals, the police, and all that sort of thing. But we really forget that all of that costs money and somebody's got to pay for it. I think we would be mistaken if we thought that we could recover very easily once we breach those levels. In other words, we get up there, and there are two things. One is that it's extremely difficult to come back once you're there. But secondly, and this is why I was hoping there's no member of the press here, politicians tell you, we'll do this now, we'll go to that level, but don't worry, in 3 years we're going to cut it and we'll get back down. I've looked at the conversation over the last 30 years or so. And at every significant budget event when this issue comes up, the government always says, in 3 years we'll bring it back down. And I remember, about 10 years ago getting into a real, well, not a big one, but certainly a very pointed discussion with the Minister of Finance at the time, the junior Minister of Finance, who thought that, as a governor of the central bank, I was meddling when I reminded him that we were breaching the 40%. So I think we would be mistaken if we believe that we can get up there and then it'll solve itself at some point. I think that will not happen. We need to manage it now, and if we are able to contain it within the 70% level, which I think we can manage, and then if we can begin to reposition our economy as we're trying to do in some areas, eventually we will grow out of it. The economy gets larger, the debt in relative terms is smaller, and so that 70% all of a sudden becomes maybe 65 and eventually even 50. That is the conclusion of my comments, and I would be happy to respond to any questions or to any comments that you have. Thank you very much. Anybody with John wish to? Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Francis, do you see any signs of this firm resolve that we need to find in the next 2 years?
I'm afraid I really don't. I believe the government means well, and I think that they would like to make some progress with this. But I'm glad you raised the question because, and I won't be long with this, I just say this. What is lacking is a plan. We need to know what the government is really wanting to do here. It can't be that we simply take this thing day by day. It is far too important for that. And that's what we don't have.
There was a note of optimism in your talk when you mentioned that about 25% of the debt was foreign
Yes.
currency.
Uh-huh.
At what rate has that portion of the debt been increasing
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
over the past?
It's been, I wanted to look at it a bit more closely. The way the central bank prepares the numbers, it's not easy to pin it down exactly as you want. But I would say, generally speaking, it's been increasing, again, during this last period of growth of about 12, 15 years, it's been increasing about the same pace as the domestic debt. Interestingly, in the short term today, because we borrow mainly in US dollars, it would be, from that point of view, from the pure cost point of view, it would make more sense for the government to borrow in US dollars. But I mean, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that because the US dollars are so cheap. Most of the debt, I think it's true, most of the debt is the foreign currency debt is based on what is called the London Interbank Offered Rate. And that rate today is almost zero. There's a margin goes on top of it, but even after you put the margin on, your total interest rate is still, if it's a floating loan, that is, the rate changes every 6 months. Your rate today is probably still no more than 3%. And if you compare with what the government pays in Bahamian dollars, it's prime plus about 0.5%, so it's about 6%. So it's twice as much that the government pays for B dollars compared to US dollars. But as I said, the difficulty with that is that, once you owe US dollars, you better know where you're going to get the US dollars to repay them. And that's one of the reasons that the Bahamas has always been very conservative on this issue. And I remember as a younger banker, I used to always remind people that the external debt service coverage ratio in the Bahamas was 5%. I mean, that's almost nothing. You don't have to even think about it. And that was when, as I said earlier, other countries would be at the level of 45% even in some cases and higher. But I think it's been roughly increasing And that's why I said that, you know, if you look out until maybe for the next fiscal year, the total debt will be about 5.5, and the foreign debt will be about a quarter of that. So it's increasing about the same rate. Trevor?
If I may.
Sure.
You mentioned that one of the strengths of the total debt is the small portion of the foreign debt.
Right.
We just touched on that now. You also mentioned that in some of the statistics how well China have done with, we know that China is present here, and I'm sure that they're quite looking at opportunities to lend more and more money to the government. But does the government have the discipline to say no and control that, or are they in fact likely to get sucked up by these external forces, which is very, very hard to control? If I may just ask you a second question, and this is using your expertise and experience as the executive chairman of BTC. Do you think that the final outcome of that, to sale large to cable and wireless, was a good thing for the Bahamas? And should we be looking at something like that for BEC, Water Corporation in Bahamas Air?
Okay. On the first point, yeah, I actually believe that the government does not just take money that you push down their throats. I don't think so, to be very frank. Now, we know that at the moment the government has to fund $465 million of the current budget. That's the whole, which has to be financed somehow. And inevitably, some of that is going to be foreign debt. So I think what they'll be doing is looking at how much of that they would like to do in foreign, maybe 100 million, and they'll be looking at very, at competitive opportunities. The thing about the Chinese, and I'm not saying that they, always do this. First of all, I think the Chinese, they're very, very shrewd people. They will have no difficulty investing in U.S. government obligations because, it's difficult to see how one day the United States cannot pay you back some way or the other. I mean, it might not be the way you like, but it'll be somehow resolved. Whereas maybe the Bahamas is a much more important risk. And I'm not so sure that the Chinese are just jumping over themselves to lend to small countries, which they may perceive as being a bit higher risk in the first place. And second point is that if they do it, chances are, and we saw this with the road financing project, the airport road, they impose tied conditions. In other words, you've got to employ Chinese labor on the projects which are being financed. Bahama, of course, is a perfect example of that. And, I mean, the stadium was a very classic case. I mean, every country does that. If we give you a stadium, you need to take our materials and even maybe our labor. But the Chinese have, I think, taken that formula to another level, mainly because they have a bigger problem than other people. They've got so much money now that they need to deploy, that, and so many people that they need to take care of, that it makes sense if they could get the Bahamas to take another 5,000 Chinese workers. You'd be crazy not to do it. As far as BTC is concerned, I have no questions about it at all. I mean, I certainly am not supposed to make any public comment about it, I don't think, but I have absolutely no doubt that it was the right thing for the economy. One can question whether, in retrospect, we got the right partner. One can have a view on that. I have a view on it. But I mean, that the Bahamas should have privatized BTC, I have no doubt. One of the benefits of doing that, apart from, renovating this company and shaking it up and cleaning it out and bringing new technology and giving it the kind of, support that high technology companies need today. You can't really run them in isolation. One of the benefits of of this is that one of the other benefits of it is that you take this company out of the hands of the government. It no longer has the opportunity, come election time, to push 100 people in there. And I'm not talking about the PLP. All of the governments did the same thing. And that is one of the terrible problems of small countries like the Bahamas. You just can't extract politics from the running. And that's why I talk about our institutions, their independence and their management and that sort of thing. Because we have such a difficult problem with that. You almost, if you have a big business in the Bahamas, and this answers the second part of your BTC question, I think, you almost are forced to put it in foreign hands so they can be run a bit more objectively. And Bahamians don't like to hear that, but I really, I think I'm as patriotic as anybody, but I think I know when we are just not getting the job done, and I believe that the development of the country maybe takes front seat to some other issues. But I know that that's a big debate, and I respect other views on that. Yes, sir.
Mr. Francis, thank you. I just wanted to ask how much of the debt that you mentioned, the 5.5 billion or 6 billion, what about the off-budget items like the contingent liabilities?
No, they're included in that.
That's included in
Oh,
the
yeah.
number?
Yeah.
Because generally speaking, it's not.
No, they are.
Okay.
They are. I mean, I spent some time looking at the numbers quite carefully.
Okay.
That's why I said sometimes the way the central bank organizes those numbers, it's not that easy to understand it. But if you focus on it, you can get to the bottom of it.
Okay. The second part of that is, why haven't governments over the years focused on reducing spending to some degree? Government spending has continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. When we see Canada 10 years ago, when they were in their difficulties, they focused on it. They didn't have to cut spending dramatically. They stuck at the level they were for 3, 4, 5 years, and they suddenly began to recover.
Right.
Why don't we focus on issues like that rather than...
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's a number of problems. One is the smallness of the country means that, it's very difficult to get people objectively, speaking to some of the issues that come up. And in any event, I believe that there is a certain lack of sophistication, which is still, which we're still grappling with. You mentioned Canada. Many people don't know it, but in the 60s, I think it was, Canada was a heavily indebted country. I mean, it had major debt. There was a time when probably the average international commercial banker probably thought that Canada would have defaulted and would have gone into kind of a tailspin. But you're right. I mean, they actually managed to work themselves out of it. And I guess this is the Willie Thompson part of it. Maybe we do have to go through a certain period when we sort of, how do you say, suffer a bit before we begin to really figure out how to get it done the right way. I just think that that's not necessary, actually, that we have got so much expertise available to us. So we've got some very, very smart people in this country today who understand this. And it's just that I don't know why it is that we are not mobilizing. Because I don't believe myself that the government is really going to do this themselves. If you look at the reforms which have taken place in the area of public finance in the Bahamas, these have been imposed by the IMF and the IDB. They haven't been homegrown, not a single one. Anything that you see that has recently been implemented over the last 10 years, 15 years or so, which makes us more accountable, we have to produce more information, that comes as a result of pressure being put on the government. And so and I don't really think it's because the government doesn't want to do it. I really don't believe that, somebody, as we all say from time to time, we shouldn't think that just because we elect persons that they have the kind of skills that are needed to run the country.
Julian.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, you're my friend and my sounding board for many years, but I have to make only one comment.
Sure.
And I have to put you on the spot with one question.
Please.
The first comment is that you've used a comparative frame in your talk, which is good, but by that I mean the question of how much debt is too much debt is a very interesting question. And all our policymakers tend to say, well, there's only 60% or 50% of the Bahamas, 100% on Jamaica. That's like saying, if we both jump off a cliff, and I'm 100 foot from the bottom, and you're 200 foot from the bottom, because you jumped after me, you're in better shape than me, right?
I may fall on you.
You might fall, right? Okay, so really, it's all going the same way.
You're right.
But the question of how much debt is too much debt, and why that debt to GDP is such a funny number. You know when there's too much debt, when you have to borrow to finance your debt, when you have to borrow to finance operational expenses. And that's where we are right now. So clearly at this level, we have too much debt. There's a very simple formula, I think, that's not very well known that you use to determine when a country has arrived at the level of too much debt. And that is when the national debt plus banking assets is more than 5 times government revenue. And we're well beyond that point. The question I want to ask you, though, is this. Mr. Bernanke has said in the United States that the goal of the Federal Reserve is to keep interest rates low until unemployment comes down to 6.5%, inflation, as long as inflation does go up to 2.5%. The monetary policy of the United States is based on that. What is the monetary policy of the Central Bank of the Bahamas, given the fact that they've chosen, it appears to me, not to use it in a time when it should have used it, and had the rates been lowered some 3 or 4 years ago, like they were in just about every other country, my contention is there'd be more people in their homes, more businesses open, and more people employed. And the second part of that question is, you touched on governance of government. I think there's very little governance of government in the Bahamas, and I think that the present governor, needs to come out and tell the public what the policy is and why she kept the rates so high for so long. Because this is the single most important economic factor which has prevented us from even having a chance to grow our way out of this problem.
Thank you, John. I want to comment very quickly on the first point. I don't think I said that we don't have too much debt. What I said was that I believe we can continue to manage at this level. And I don't think we want to go higher than we are already committed to go. In other words, I think that 70, I would not say it outside of this room, but I think 70 is going to happen. Something like that. We already, next year, we're at 65. I mean, we can't prevent that because, the wheel is already moving. And from 65 to 70, I mean, I'm just assuming that we're not going to be able to stop it that quickly. So I'm not saying at all, no, I agree with you on that point. I think, that we are too indebted, but I believe that because of the detail, we can actually manage it. Now, You know, regarding the central bank and monetary policy, I don't know if I would like to try to launch into a very technical discussion, because you and I have talked about these kinds of things often. But all I would say is this, and I think this is very important, ladies and gentlemen. You know, what John said about the Fed, U.S. Fed and the Central Bank of the Bahamas is important. But what he didn't say, and I think I agree with him on it, is that in the Bahamas, one of the things we lack is a policy determining mechanism between the central bank and the government, or the central bank and some group which is appointed maybe with government's input. Because it is not the job of the Central Bank of the Bahamas to determine interest rates. It is very important to understand that. You can't appoint a civil servant, the governor of the central bank, and give that person the authority to make those kinds of decisions. That cannot happen. It is too important an issue. There has got to be some other means of which, and you and I have talked about this, I mean, it exists in the UK, it exists in the United States actually, in a fashion. Throughout Latin America you will find it, and so on, where you have a body which is appointed, and it really interacts with the central bank to make those kinds of decisions, or maybe in some instances recommendations to the Minister of Finance, so that, you know, these decisions can be implemented. So that's all I would say about that. I don't think that, I really disagree. I don't know if Mr. Bernanke actually said it that way, but you know, I've listened to central bankers all my career in central bank, and you know, repeatedly they say their job is to look after two things: the integrity of the currency and inflation. And inflation actually plays on the currency. Inflation is what either makes or unmakes your currency. And that's their job, to ensure that there is price stability throughout the economy. That is the job of the central bank, not to determine interest rates. And so that is where you and I disagree. Now, I don't disagree with you on the other parts of it that you mentioned, that if we had lower interest rates, I think you're right. There would be other consequences, but nevertheless, I think you're right. It probably would have created more jobs, in the short term anyway.
Yeah, but to go to your point about the insurance company saying that fine, if interest rates are lowered and the present value of their liabilities will go up and they have to raise more funding.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is that if interest rates don't come down, the economy doesn't pick up, people aren't going to have enough money to pay the premiums in the first place to even have insurance.
Yeah, I agree.
So you can't have a policy that just defends one sector.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Not the rest of the economy.
No question about it. And I was on the Insurance Commission at the time. I felt that there wasn't a case to be made. I didn't see how the insurance companies could expect that the central bank was going to change its position just because insurance companies would be affected. I agree with you.
Two questions, one here, and Mr. Alexiou, and
I don't
Mr.
have a
Bethel, the
question.
last three.
Okay.
I would just like to congratulate you on a very diplomatic shot across the bow with the current financial administration.
I just hope that they don't read it in the press tomorrow.
Well, he left. Mr. Alexiou?
Oh, the only,
Mike?
maybe it's related to interest rates, and I go back to the old question: why can't we have foreign exchange openness where we get U.S. dollars exchange, not having to go through exchange control? Does this got something to do with interest rates? And as you say, the government would be best borrowing U.S. dollars. I've also felt it would be best to borrow U.S. dollars, but you do.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Having how to pay it back is always the big issue.
it's you know, this gentleman and I were just chatting across the table earlier, and we were talking, you know, having to admit that culturally, we are already very, very close to the United States. And you can feel that when you're here. And this is one of the last bastions. I mean, some people feel that we don't even need a B dollar. We may as well just use the US dollars, and we don't need a central bank, because if you don't have your own currency, you don't really need your own central bank. And you know, and we can do away with all of this and just we tie into what goes on in Florida. And there's a case to be made for it. I'm not so sure it's something that we really want to do, but I think there's a case to be made. It's a very complicated thing what you're suggesting, Mike. I mean, if you start, you know, maybe adopting interest rates which are the same as in the United States, you know, it does really have lots of complications to it. I mean, it's really not a very simple thing. We have a kind of whole system built in the Bahamas which we have maintained. And I was talking with somebody before we began earlier. It has worked because it saved the Bahamas sometimes. You know, our banks have not had 1 penny of so-called subprime paper. So the obligations which has sunk many a bank across the world. I used to be a director of a bank in Bermuda, ended up with huge amounts of this subprime paper and almost sunk the bank. You wouldn't find that in the Bahamas. Why? Because exchange controls not prohibit, but make it so difficult that it's not going to happen. And at times it has really helped us. Now, I'm not saying that overall it's net good or bad. I'm really not sure, to be very honest with you. But I can understand why we have this system in place. And we are trying to phase out certain aspects of it so that we can open up the economy even more than it really is. But personally, I believe that some of these things that we have worked to a certain extent anyway. But, you know, I'm not really arguing to keep it. I mean, I felt some years ago that inevitably we were going to be absorbed into a kind of regional bloc, and that, you know, we would belong to one currency, the United States dollar, just like the Asians, you know, would belong to a currency bloc, and the Europeans. But that has not happened in this region as quickly as I thought it might have some time ago. Yes, sir. Yeah, Dick.
I learned one of the most fascinating chapters in Dr. Rogers' book that the foreign exchange system in Bermuda is totally different from ours and seems to work extremely well. In Bermuda, as I understand it, Bermudians are allowed to have B dollar accounts, Bermuda dollar accounts, and US dollar accounts. Yes. In their banks in Bermuda.
Correct.
And whereas a certain outflow of funds, it's met by a certain even bigger inflow of funds, so that there is not a foreign exchange problem. They don't have the problem that ties our central bank up in knots of trying to keep the parity between the B dollar and the US dollar. Now, if this is really so in Bermuda, I wonder why the Bahamas cannot adopt the same system.
Well, I mean, certainly John is accurate about that. You know, the way I feel about it is that you have to remember that Bermuda is really, at the end of the day, a much simpler economy. It is a microcosm of the Bahamas. If you look at the history of Bermuda and the ownership of wealth in Bermuda, you can understand that Bermuda essentially blends into the external environment for the purposes of currency. And the fact that Bermudans have that choice is almost immaterial. I mean, Bermuda, for all practical purposes, is a dollarized economy, meaning US dollarized economy. In addition, as a very small place, I mean, 30,000, 40,000 people, it has a huge industry, the insurance industry, which does have very significant amounts of capital there, and can deploy that capital there. I mean, the position in Bermuda is just entirely different. It's not at all the same. You know, I always, you know, I like tongue in cheek, I say to people sometimes, the Bahamas is a real economy. It may not be a good one, it may be very small, but it is a real economy. But I don't think, and I mean, I love Bermuda. I really, you know, I really do like Bermuda very much. But I don't think you can really compare it. It's the same as Cayman. You can't compare them. They're very small, very, very simple economies.
When you have a fixed exchange rate like we do, you either have to limit the flow of capital in and out, or you have to have limits on your monetary policy. And we've chosen to limit capital coming in and out. But to have the right to change our monetary policy. But we've never made use of this right to change monetary policy. And therein really lies the problem. Now, Dick mentioned Bermuda, and Bermuda is very interesting. We could actually dollarize our economy within a 5-year period if we allow for the inflow of Bahamian-owned foreign currencies coming to the Bahamas, dividends, interest, capital gains, whatever, come back in. And if we allow the banks and the direct foreign investors to pay in hotels, to pay employees in US dollars, to cost them to pay them in Canadian dollars, and to pay their bills in US dollars, after the 5-year period, I believe that we'd be in exactly the same position as Bermuda, where they have 116 US dollars every $100 per meter. And this would bring down the cost of capital and allow the economy to grow. The only people who would be hurt by it would be the banks to a certain extent, because they wouldn't get the foreign exchange in conversion. And it would take some of the control, the big C, in inverted commas, away from the government or the Prime Minister today, who essentially controls every single investment that comes in this country and leaves this country. That's like Obama determining every investment that comes in and out. And I believe that if we did that, that would be one of the ways this country could really begin to grow.
Well, you know, the only comment I would make, John, is that, and I wanted to say this when you were talking earlier about the public debt, and you were giving us a formula for assessing, you know, countries', I guess, viability. The thing about it is, you have read as much as I have in this area. These are not simple issues. It is not a science, actually. We like to pretend that it is, but it is an art. It is an art, managing all of this. Nobody has a set of formulas that will give you a certain result. I don't care who it is, and there's just far too much going on out there, and we don't understand a lot of it. And that's why, you know, we can't have formulas. If we knew what the flows are and why, you know, rates at which they happen and who is doing them and so on, you could build models and then you can predict things. But that's been tried hundreds of times by good economists, and at the end of the day they always arrive at things that they cannot explain. Why? Because it is the real world out there. And it's not as simple as just putting some formulas in place and saying this is what's going to happen. It would be nice if it were as simple as that, but it is really not.
So that's why I started what I was saying by saying it's from the functionality of government compromise.
Sorry, John. Last question.
Last question, then we got to finish.
It's getting late.
Yes, we have to finish.
I'm sorry, Julian.
Costa.
It's probably a simple question. But
Sure.
who sets the interest rates?
Well, I mean, the interest rates are really set by the banks. By the banks.
So, I mean, it's back to Jonathan's comment earlier,
Yeah.
that the government that's here to look after the best interests of people, that these funds
Yes.
If it makes sense.
I think.
And we continue, it just doesn't seem to be intelligent to me.
Mhm.
To allow people to set the interest rates who have a personal vested interest in it.
Yeah.
Whereas you have a government who's elected to serve the needs of the people and can have the authority to put that authority with the central bank. And it isn't done.
You know, I would say it a bit differently. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but may I just suggest something? In a number of areas of the economy, if you think about it, what you do is you leave it to business to fix the prices, to set the prices depending on supply and demand, that sort of thing. What you do is you police that. You put in place competition authorities and those kinds of things, which ensure that the playing field is level and that they are playing fair. That's what a government is supposed to do, not to substitute itself for the economy and then to start fixing rates and so on. You don't want that. I mean, you know, that is what they tried in Eastern Europe. It didn't work. And wherever else it's been tried around the world, it failed. Because nobody can allocate resources better than the economy. And that is what the banking system is. Now, it is not perfect, because you're right. The banks, left to their own devices, and we know that this happens. I mean, I was reading a horrible story today or yesterday in the paper about Bank of America in the US, telling its loan officers not to approve qualified borrowers who wanted to restructure their mortgages because the bank would earn more money if these people were pushed into default. That's the sort of thing that the banks, I agree, do if you don't police them properly. That is what the regulator is there for.
Julian, the interest rates were taken out when the Labour government gave that responsibility to the Bank of England.
Mm-hmm.
The argument was that interest rates shouldn't be set by politicians for political reasons. It's a technical issue. That was the argument.
Well, yeah, but you see, what John will tell you is, and he's right about this, you have at the Bank of England something called a Monetary Policy Committee. And it's not just Bank of England people. There are even representatives from the government on the MPC. And that is the body which actually makes these decisions, not the governor of the Bank of England.
But not exclusively politicians, just politicians on the monetary policy.
That's correct.
That's what they did.
Yeah. I mean, they never gave 100% authority, Gordon Brown didn't, to the Bank of England to fix interest rates. No. This is such a fascinating area.
Francis, I think it was Aristotle who said that learning was one of man's chief pleasures. And although I think it'd be fair to say that your address this evening at least verged on painful, it was still a pleasure and a privilege to hear from you.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Institute, I'm to present you with a few more books to read in case you were running short.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We get to hold hands a bit more.
Thank you. Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I really will. Within a couple of weeks.